An aid worker's personal security is impacted by where the aid worker is, who they are, and their role and organization. Organizations have a duty of care to take all reasonable measures to protect their staff from foreseeable risks, including those that emerge due to personal characteristics. I am Tara Arthur with the Global Interagency Security Forum. Join us as we explore the interplay between inclusivity and security risk management. So, Araba, thank you for joining us and being a part of this series. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Tara. It's such a pleasure and also such a privilege to invite me to do something like this. I'm not going to lie, this is very new for me.
Well, we're happy to have you, and we thought it would be great if you could start off with just a little introduction, if you could share your name, what organization you work with, and just tell us a little bit about you.
So, hello, I'm Araba. Greetings from Nairobi. I am the Global Director of Safety and Security with the International Rescue Committee, the IRC. I'm very fresh to the role. I think I'm 2.5, getting on for 3 months in, after a brief period of doing a bit of freelancing, still very much so within the security sector. And prior to that, I was working with the NRC, the Norwegian Refugee Council. I suppose I'm what you could describe as a security advisor through and through. I used to be in the British Army. I used to be a soldier. So my first taste of Afghanistan, my first deployment, was in uniform, and it was hugely formative for me. It was a massively influential experience, and the first or maybe second in a recurring theme of seeking out some of the most vibrant and complex and beautiful places to work and spend one's time.
That's amazing. What a great experience you come to the table with today. I'd love to hear more about your connection to security risk management and how you kind of found yourself here on this side in the humanitarian sector.
I think when it comes to security risk management, it's definitely turned from something that started off as quite an amorphous instinct to solve problems, to maybe go and seek some trouble, seek some challenges, get into some remote, interesting, complex places and situations where you go, right, how do we make this happen? And that took me, first of all, took me kind of into the military, then into the private security sector, and then the humanitarian security sector really offered me what I see as the real cutting edge of security risk management. And it was only really when I tried to make my escape at the end of last year and spend some time knocking around did I realize that this is one of the most interesting arenas for security risk management, where, let's face it, we're often under-resourced. We don't have the bandwidth of managers and leaders. We often don't have organizational cultures that are massively conducive to supporting our work. So there's a bit of an uphill struggle. But when it comes to delivering and when it comes to the value of what we deliver, I really do think it's very satisfying and challenging and stimulating. Security risk management has also, my relationship with it has really changed recently. I've been doing some reading and thinking that's begun to really inform the how I want to go about doing security risk management, taking some of the fantastic stuff that's going on perhaps in finance and behavioral insights and other arenas, and bringing it to the table. And I think this is a really interesting time for that, as we're increasingly moving away from a traditional approach, let's say, or maybe a more mainstream approach to safety and security of your gates, guards and guns and all that good stuff. So the further we move from that, although I've got plenty of time for that kind of thing, love a good run of HESCOs and proper physical security. but the facets are growing. There's more and more sides of this, and I think it's a really interesting time to bring more thinking and ideas and innovation and creativity to the work that we're doing.
That's great. Thank you for that. I think you've definitely shared some really interesting dynamics to how you're, engaging with SRM. And I think just to kind of continue this conversation and bring you a bit into this series that we're talking about, which is on inclusivity, it'd be great to know a little bit about your thinking around SRM and inclusivity, and how does that interplay from your vantage point?
I definitely don't think you can do exclusive security risk management. And I think that, and as a corollary, I think it's really important that we bring everyone into what we're doing, because if we're going to miss something, and if we miss something in our line of work, then that can have some significant consequences. If we're narrow-minded, if we narrow frame our thinking, if we fail to consider the totality of a context or the operating environment that we're in, that's not a recipe for the insight and the agility and the smart safety and security practices that we need. So I think inclusivity is essential to make sure that we've got access to the perspectives, the minds, the lived experiences that need to feed into a strong security risk management practice. I think for me, as a woman of color coming into this as well, it's quite personal too, because I think it has, and this is something that's taken me a while to really recognize, I think my identity has impacted on my experience of safety and security in the humanitarian as well as other sectors too. And recognizing where that's not only maybe brought some challenges, but also where it's brought some huge advantages and opportunities too.
I think that's really well said, and it's definitely interesting to hear how you've brought in your personal reflections into how that contributes and plays a role in how you view SRM and inclusivity. And I think it would be great to hear a little bit more about this, if you will. As you've just mentioned, you've come into a new role at IRC, and thinking about this conversation between SRM and inclusivity, how are you approaching that? And, what considerations do you think an organization should think about with regards to the relationship between something like duty of care and inclusivity?
Coming into the IRC, there's been a lot of discussion about these issues under the umbrella of the wider DEI agenda. There's a lot of thinking and a lot of resources going into it with across the organization, but also within our unit as well, within the safety and security unit. Our teams are doing a lot to capture this. We're looking at making sure that we have women who are security focal points in the field. We're really looking to make sure that we're working on a gender balance. We're also looking at a fundamental definition of inclusivity, of inclusion, to include others within our processes. For instance, when we're doing our security risk assessment, trying to make sure that we are including people, we are including a spectrum of staff within those conversations. So thinking about gender identities, thinking about where our staff are coming from. Are they foreign national staff? Are they from the city where this conversation is taking place, or the location? From field sites? Are they junior? Are they senior? Are they support? Are they programs? Really trying to capture a cross-section of our staff to ensure that, again, that range of lived experience is included within our assessment. Though I've seen and heard of a lot of great work on this, I don't doubt that there is plenty more to be done, and that I think we are at the beginning of this journey. I think we're making a strong start, and we've definitely got to keep that effort going. A big thing for me when it comes to bringing inclusion to life within safety and security is making sure that safety and security is accessible. in a very basic sense. I don't know when was the last time you opened up a safety and security SOP or policy document or something like that, but it's boring and usually gets closed within a few seconds to minutes, and it's not accessible. It's targeted often at dedicated safety and security personnel. And if they are the only ones that we are targeting with our communications, with our knowledge, with what we're creating, then how can we really expect others to access that knowledge? And if we're not making it easy for others to access it, I think it's difficult to completely blame others when security is excluded from other elements of the organization. So I think there's a lot that we can be doing to make sure that safety and security is fundamentally accessible as a first step to making it inclusive.
That's such a really great point in terms of how can you make this real for such a wide spectrum of people that need to understand it. And I think I want to ask you a bit of how can you make something like a security policy come to life in that way? How can you make a security policy or policies be a bit more accessible?
Number one, translate it. make it available in multiple languages, and perhaps not just the major languages of an organization, but thinking about the languages that are spoken at the field level. That, of course, needs resourcing. I'm not going to lie, translation services are not cheap, but I think anything worth doing is expensive, really. And I think this process is part of that. I think also how we communicate, how we write, I think is very important. Thinking about George Orwell's rules about why I write in his essay, and how we write, and making sure that things are concise and clear. Of course, I can only really speak from a perspective of writing English. I'm not sure how this works in other languages because my other languages are rubbish. I'll be very honest about that. And I think we can really be doing something quite tangible of thinking about, how does this read? How is this easy? Is this attractive when it comes to our communication styles?
That's definitely really important words there. I think that, yeah, that's super insightful, because if people are not digesting the information they need to, we may need to look at things differently. So thank you for sharing that. I think, as we talk about engaging content and making things and information a bit more accessible for different audiences, when we come to something like informed consent, how does that factor in for you?
I think that's really very important. And you mentioned previously about duty of care. And I think that's one of the real pillars of duty of care from a safety and security perspective, is making sure that we do get that informed consent from our people in the field. And the concept of our people in the field is extremely broad. It's very easy to think just about our staff who are perhaps captured in an employment contract or something along those lines. But when we think about informed consent and duty of care, we often have to think broader, and there's often not a right answer about this, but an answer needs to be given by an organization about how far does our duty of care go? Is it just the people who have signed on the dotted line of an employment contract? Is it also volunteers? Is it persons who we're assisting through our work, partners, suppliers, these other huge groups who are involved, and making a clear decision about our duty of care towards them. Informed consent, when it comes towards our staff, our volunteers, I think is almost one of the easier ones to manage. And I also think it takes an investment. It's not just kind of signing on, here's a piece of paper that's quite difficult to digest on a dotted line to say that you've been fully briefed on the risks and the threats and the hazards that you're going to face in your work. Some of the best approaches that I've seen have been structured briefings led by a person in person, obviously a lot more difficult with COVID now, where you sit down with the people in your duty of care and you explain to them, you create the space for questions and queries and clarifications. So at the end, when I confirm my informed consent and sign on the dotted line, that really does mean something, that they feel informed and they give their consent to work under these conditions.
Yeah, I think that's a really powerful point you're making, because it almost is definitely like everything has to work in full harmony from what I'm capturing from you. Just how you can have those conversations and tailor it to that person you're having a conversation with. I'd be curious to hear a bit more about some more of the deep dives into how you might prepare someone to feel like they have that informed consent, or some of the training or the way your organization prepares someone to feel like they're ready to make that next step.
I think in reality, I'm not sure how ready people are until they hit the ground. And even then, when they've been on the ground and they've been doing the job, until things take a turn for the worst or grow in complexity or the crisis hits. But that doesn't preclude us from doing our utmost to try and ensure that there is that preparedness, briefings, communications, an ongoing conversation as well, I think is extremely important too, making sure that the space is continuously there for this two-way communication, both for an organization to communicate on risks, mitigation measures, all that good stuff, but also to receive feedback as well. You mentioned there about training too. Of course, in an ideal world, everyone would receive high fidelity, practical, hands-on, multi-day courses on personal security management, on preparedness and awareness and all that kind of thing before they even start work. But unfortunately, that is seldom, if ever, the case, really. And also to get the most of that out of that training, coming back to the core idea of inclusivity, is that they need to feel that they are seen and that they are heard and that their perspectives are valid. And you've got the archetype of the heat course, right? Where you've got your suite of ex-military instructors who are hell-bent on getting tears of blood out of participants before the end of the course. That environment isn't always conducive to people allowing themselves to really lean into the training process and be honest and communicate on their vulnerabilities and their fears and concerns. And I think there's often a risk with training is that people can kind of close themselves off and harden and being ready to face what comes. And that doesn't help the conversation. That doesn't help the feedback loop.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting and some really insightful reflections there. I think what you're saying about having the space is something I'd be interested to hear a bit more about from you. Is while in the training realm, it might be difficult to have some of those elements continually be factored in, but how generally would you say that an organization might create that inclusive environment and make it something that's not just one-off, but there's kind of this ongoing space for that conversation?
I think on that one, starting from the top, security culture within an organization is very important. This idea that it is everyone's responsibility. It's not exclusively the responsibility of a small group of safety and security officers, managers, advisors, directors, whatever the terminology is in the organization, is that actually safety and security lies with everyone. Risk owners are usually actually country directors and area managers and people in management positions. And I think the key ways of creating that space is ensuring that it's part of everyone's role within an organization. I'm thinking particularly in the field that, you don't have to wait for a visit for the security manager to a remote office location to talk about your safety and security concerns. That conversation can happen with your area manager, your line manager, with anyone else who you feel is appropriate, that it's not just solely held by this often, frankly, small group of people within an organization. I think thinking about who these people are as well, who are our security focal points, who are our security officers, who are our security leadership as well is important. And I think this is where representation becomes particularly important. And we're seeing a real push towards that, trying to see more women in security management, security advisory, security reporting roles. Perhaps people, for instance, an example is where you've got non-dedicated security focal points. Having those people, I think the default is often logistics, often some poor logistics assistant, often gets voluntold that they're now the security focal point too. Maybe we could also think about having those security focal points being in programs, perhaps being in protection in some of the gender units that we're seeing being formed, seeking to put safety and security in some different places as well could be another way to be creating space for this conversation. Localization, having more security personnel from the areas in which we are operating too, as well, I think is so important. Also to capture the unique understanding and lived experience, and making sure that that's fed into the how that we're doing safety and security management too. I think this is a double-edged sword though, because on the one hand, representation is vital, but on the other hand, we're not always going to be able to see ourselves and every single identity factor reflected in front of us. And what is that to say that, okay, fine, if we can't have this particular group directly represented, then the conversation of inclusivity just doesn't happen? Does that mean that the conversation just stops? No, not on the agenda. We can't find a woman or someone from this town to take this role, so we're not allowed to talk about these things. Done. Not happening. I don't think that's particularly sustainable either. The fact of the matter is that we need to be able to create this space regardless of who's filling that security focal point kind of space. And I think this is a question that I'm really interested in, is how can we create that trust and that open energy that allows people to feel included within safety and security without necessarily feeling that it's solely tied to the identity and the makeup of the person taking on that safety and security function.
I think your question you just asked is so powerful, and I want to ask it to you. What I kind of want you to think about your own question, and have you been thinking about it? Do you feel like you have some responses to that? Because I think you're right about that element of trust it's super important in both on the policy and organizing, and both on the organizational side as much as individuals feeling like they can engage. And so I'm just wondering if you have some reflections from your own question.
It's so tough. I think because I don't know about you, but I was thinking about the people that I've met and that I've worked with. There are some people that you just feel comfortable with, you feel at home with, you feel that it's okay to make mistakes and be vulnerable and bounce ideas and be creative and voice doubts. That is the big thing that I find is often dangerous, is when people don't feel able to voice doubts, and you end up in the middle of this horrible situation, and then you turn around to go, and then someone goes, "Oh, it's a bit, I thought this was a bad idea." I was like, "Why didn't you say anything?" "Oh, because you're in charge." I'm like, yes, but that does mean that there isn't room for learning and sharing
right.
Presentation. So, and I don't know how to capture that. I don't know. I wish I could figure out a key attribute that we could put in job descriptions to say that you're going to have.
That would be very helpful,
factor. Wouldn't it? Wouldn't it just?
Well, it's interesting because of what you're sharing, because, you think of some of the core elements of security risk management, and you think of the element of trust in understanding one another. And I think that you've hit something that's pretty insightful for sure.
That's very kind of you, but I feel a lot more. I feel a lot happier if we could somehow come up with a way of going firm on this. Because the other reason why I think it's important to capture that somehow is that, again, coming back to this flip side of inclusivity, this exclusivity, is that I don't think anyone should be left behind in this process. I don't want people, I guess the usual identities, your kind of cis white male who have so far dominated this industry, to suddenly feel that they've been excluded and somehow that they have to be defensive and aren't part of this. And that's, for me, that's not what this is about. This is about bringing forward the voices and the lived experience of perhaps those we're not hearing from a lot at the moment. It doesn't mean we're shutting out another huge group of people. I don't think that's what this is about at all. And I do fear that that is a darker side of where these conversations can take us.
Yeah, I think you've definitely shed light on an important part of just the entire conversation on how can we have safe conversations about the things that are needed to be discussed and explored, with it being very inclusive of all. And I'm just curious about kind of leading you down that road a little bit more. And do you feel like you have examples of how this is working very well in the sector? Do you feel like there's good examples of how people are coming together and organizations are addressing these things in systematic ways that are, reflective of some of the values and perspectives you were just discussing?
This is my thinking face, by the way. The examples that I'm thinking of immediately they're not organizational. They're not these big, huge strategic efforts. They're the ones being made by managers, leaders, people who take on leadership roles on the ground and in the field. They're the ones that make sure that there are meetings between groups of people, that they go out of their way to create these spaces, either formally or informally. Kind of, I think an old-fashioned organizational tool that could be used well in this way is the idea of the staff representatives, of creating channels of reporting and communication outside of your more formal lines. Little initiatives, like I remember I used to have a meeting, ad hoc meeting. I was never very organized, where we would bring all of our female staff together to just talk and share. And eventually, of course, it doesn't happen immediately, but eventually things start to come up that can be turned into tangible efforts. Things like female restrooms and prayer rooms and things like that. I need to find some better terminology, because I remember when I was in the military, it used to drive me absolutely crazy being referred to as a female. You have the men and then you have the females. I'm like, I'm not a dog. I'm a woman. I have a gender, not just a sex. It's not some inconvenient biological fact that that I'm a woman. So anyway, sorry, that's a kind of a side point there. But I think it's partly to do with the orientation of my thinking, that is that a lot of this stuff needs to come from the bottom up. And then it's the role of organizations to both support and resource and also remove obstacles too. So, for instance, if it emerges that a woman's rest room or prayer room is the requirement, making sure that there's funding available for that. And these kind of things. I think it's often less to do with always directly prescribing solutions and more just allowing for opportunities to emerge and be followed up on and supported, because it's the fundamental principle that people closest to the problem are often the ones best placed to come up with the solutions. And I don't want to be too prescriptive in this, but I want to make sure that, again, this idea of creating space and support for these initiatives, however they may be, to come to the fore. I thought of something else then and now I can't remember. It'll come back to me.
That's really, really great. I think, thank you for that. I think you've definitely illuminated some new thinking and some considerations that are worthwhile for us to
Oh, sorry,
explore.
one more thing. Now I remember what I was going
Go
to
for
say.
it. Yeah.
The idea of, I know it's going to sound really basic and really silly, but you know, if you're a senior manager and you go and visit a field site or an office or something like that, bring everyone together. You know, bring everyone together from all corners who maybe they don't speak English. Find someone who does and translate. Drivers, guards, cooks, cleaners, anyone you can find. And you may spend 10 minutes talking to a group of people. And then at the end of it, you've got some very blank faces looking back at you. And you think, well, thanks very much, guys. Or, and this is often the case that I've found, is that for the first time, a lot of people who have felt marginalized and so separate from the kind of inner, upper, higher workings of this Leviathan entity, suddenly like, oh, wow, I'm seen and I'm heard. And this is, it's putting a face to this previously amorphous concept of leadership or management. And I find in those conversations, so much has come up. There's been so much learning, so much insight, so much sharing. And it's, I guess, a very literal example of creating space, bringing people together and giving that time and that energy. Maybe only silence fills that space, but just maybe a few other things might come up and fill it too.
That's powerful. And it's almost, you said at the start that it sounds very basic, but sometimes maybe those basic things need to be amplified in order to have the bigger impact. So I think that's really a useful comment you've just shared. And, and kind of thinking a little bit about this opening, or I don't know if you would call it demystifying kind of what's going on to make that space, and kind of following along that trajectory a bit. I thought I'd ask you if you have examples of how these intersections kind of come into play, decision-making process you've had to go through as an organization. And what did that look like in practice? And how did that experience kind of play out for you and through your lens?
I think this is a difficult question for me to answer because I have spent so much of my career, I suppose, so blind to so many of these issues. This is a really new conversation for me. And what's been interesting, and thinking about it, my mind is whirring. Not sure if you can hear the kind of cogs clunking away as I think about it. And I'm sure there have been so many examples where intersectionality has played a factor in organizational decision making, either because of the identity factors of the people affected by the decision, or these identity factors of the people making the decision. And I think that's, as we go forward with this conversation, there's going to have to be a lot of retrospection and introspection about where has this come up? Because I certainly feel quite oblivious to a lot of this. And I think that's why I struggle to pull up, to think of an example, not because I don't think it's ever happened, but I think because I've not been aware. And I think it's this awareness that I'm glorified. This is a glorified way of saying I don't know. And I think what's also important about the conversation about inclusivity is being able to say that, is being able to say, I don't know, I wasn't paying attention. And that part of the journey now is making sure that we are paying attention and that we are aware. And this is going to bug me now. And you're going to get an email from me at like 5 o'clock in the morning sometime in the next coming days saying, I thought of a perfect example of what you were talking about.
I'll welcome that 5 a.m. awakening. No, I think you just actually answered it very well in that sometimes it's the questions that we are asking ourselves to learn and to also acknowledge what we don't yet know. And sometimes that in itself is part of the journey and where we need to be in the next steps to progress. So thank you for sharing and being authentic in your response. I think that, you've shared so many interesting points, both operationally when it comes to inclusivity and how an organization might really be looking at this and integrating it into their SRM practices. I would love to ask you if you're open to you as you've touched a bit on your positionality and your personal reflections in the sector. Are there things that you think that this conversation through your own personal experiences or vantage point that you think are important for us to explore or to think through?
One of the big things that comes up for me, I remember being instructing on a course, and there was a session on gender security, and one of the tasks led to a conversation about the impact of one's gender on their experience and their work and things like that. And it really broke my heart that for the women in the group, they only saw their gender as a liability, as a vulnerability, as a weakness. And that was hard for me to see because from my experience, I've always seen my femininity and my interesting heritage as a strength, as an advantage, as an opportunity, as an asset. And that is something that I would really like to see more of. This isn't just about righting wrongs. This is about bringing strength and innovation and opportunity to the fore. And that's definitely something that I would like to take forward as part of this personally on this subject. That's definitely something that I would like to take forward.
That's powerful. Thank you for that. And I hope your journey continues on that trajectory for sure. And something you did say about the representation and its importance in the sector. Do you feel like there's a lot of opportunity in where the sector is headed with regards to representation? And do you have you've touched a little bit on it, but do you have some reflections on how that fits into what you've just shared?
I hate diversity hires and I hate quota filling. And I think any professional worth their salt would be mortified to think that they were taking on a new position or opportunity purely because of the color of their skin or their background or their mental attributes or physical attributes or what's between their legs. And I see representation as extremely important. I also feel like it needs to be done properly. Otherwise, it's going to undermine the effort. If we're looking at representation just as something that's just a quota to be filled and a kind of a proxy for satiating some organizational demand or mandate, then I think that's a really unhealthy way for the conversation to go. But if we are using representation as a way to draw on and include, again, that wealth of lived experience and different perspectives and identities, then that's definitely something that's going to be really exciting.
Thank you so much, Araba. I would like to just ask you if you have any key takeaways that you'd like to share with us. Any final thoughts that you think, this is definitely something I want to make sure you leave us with today?
Your questions have already probed and pushed a lot of my thinking on this. One thing that's kind of popped up while we've been chatting is we've talked a lot about organizations, and you see that a lot in the coverage on this subject is about what organizations are doing, what steps organizations are taking, and things like that. And I think it's really impersonal. And the question that I think is really important is, what are leaders doing? And leaders, not just as the people who are the CEOs and the directors and people like that, and your more conventional forms of manager, but also everyone else in between who takes on a leadership role within their organizations. As leaders, what are we doing to make sure that people feel included, that people feel heard and seen? And what are we doing to earn the trust of the people around us so that they can allow themselves to be heard and seen? For me, that's really important, because otherwise, if we're just thinking about organizations, then it's really easy to just pass the buck and go, oh, my organization isn't doing it, or my organization isn't doing this, my organization is doing that. When actually the question is, what am I doing?
That is definitely some powerful words to leave us with. Thank you so much, Araba, for sharing and being a part of this series and for imparting us with your wisdom today.
That's really kind of you, Tara. I'm not sure if wisdom is the word, but it's been an absolute delight talking with you.
Thank you. We look forward to continuing this conversation forward. Have a great day.
Magic. Take care.
The Global Interagency Security Forum is a member-led NGO with a global network of over 130 member organizations and affiliates. We are committed to achieving sustainable access for populations in need through improved safety and security for aid workers and operations. GISF's original research, collaboration, and events drive positive change in security risk management across the humanitarian sector. We operate according to the humanitarian principles and lead on best practices and innovation by pushing for a collaborative and inclusive approach to security risk management.
The people doing the world's most important work are up against the biggest challenges. Since the 90s, security incidents involving NGOs have increased as their independence and impartiality no longer protect them. Humanitarians are actively targeted, as well as exposed to the risks of conflict and disaster, facing kidnapping, injury, and death in order to help those in need. And the threats to their safety means their ability to help diminishes too. NGOs began to create roles for dedicated security professionals, but they often lacked support and resources and worked in isolation. In 2006, a group of them from the UK and Ireland got together to develop coherent approaches to security risk management in the humanitarian space, eventually becoming an established network, the European Interagency Security Forum. With a strategic, inclusive, and collaborative focus, the forum has created a center of excellence, facilitates a peer-to-peer network, builds capacity for security risk management, and provides a voice for practitioners, reaching over 100 members. In response to growing demand, it has now gone global, bringing different perspectives, expertise, and resources to make core activities such as original research, trainings, workshops, and knowledge sharing more impactful than ever. As a result, organizations are able to build their security risk management on an even stronger foundation to keep more aid workers safe and enable sustainable access to communities in need. With a vision to see the work of the whole third sector done more effectively by supporting NGOs around the world, we are the Global Interagency Security Forum.